When the United States created the atomic bomb in 1945, they didn't hesitate to use it to help end the Second World War. But with the Cold War came new fear. Soviet and American planners had near-apocalyptic power at their fingertips, but it was difficult to see how they could use it without destroying the world. Many asked themselves a fundamental question. Can you win a nuclear war? Atomic weapons development in the 1940s fundamentally shifted the strategic and military status quo between the great powers. In 1945, the U.S. already showed even primitive atomic weapons' destructive potential. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested their own bomb to rebalance a growing technological and military gulf between the two superpowers. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, U.S. President Harry Truman was slow to adopt a formal policy. For him, the bombs were not a weapon of war, but purely a political tool to be used only in the most extreme circumstances. As he reminded his generals, the president had to approve the use of atomic weapons. You have to understand that this isn't a military weapon. It is used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses. Despite some reservations, the U.S. continued to build up its stockpiles and aircraft capable of delivering them. Truman reassured his military staff he would not hesitate to use the bomb again if he needed to. The Soviet strategy also didn't change much after developing their own bomb. In 1946, Stalin even suggested the bomb only inspired fear in those who lacked a strong will. I do not believe the atomic bomb to be so serious a force as certain politicians are inclined to consider it. Atomic bombs are intended to frighten the weak nerves, but they cannot decide the outcome of a war, since they are by no means adequate for this purpose. Following the U.S. bombings in 1945, Stalin deliberately pursued an aggressive, obstinate policy to show the U.S. that he was not intimidated. Once the Soviet Union got its own bomb in 1949, Stalin simply added them to the Red Army's inventory. The principles of war he developed during WW the so-called 5 permanently operating factors, remained intact. These focused on the morale, quantity, quality, and support for conventional land forces and the stability of the rear. Then, in 1953, things suddenly changed. In the U.S., President Dwight Eisenhower replaced Truman, and in the Soviet Union, Stalin died and Nikita Khrushchev, after a power struggle, became first secretary. With these leadership changes came technological developments. On November 1, 1952, the U.S. detonated the first hydrogen thermonuclear weapon. Within H-bombs, a fission reaction, like in an atomic bomb, is used to trigger the fusion of hydrogen atoms, releasing even more energy in an explosion. H-bombs can be thousands of times more powerful than atomic weapons, creating so-called city killers. Their potential was not lost on UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill. There is an immense gulf between the atomic and the hydrogen bomb. The atomic bomb, with all its terrors, did not carry us outside the scope of human control or manageable events in thought or action, in peace or war. But with the hydrogen bomb, the entire foundation of human affairs was revolutionized, and mankind placed in a situation both measurable and laden with doom. Less than a year after the U.S. test, the Soviets tested their own hydrogen bomb, although it was not yet in a deliverable state. Not only were hydrogen bombs more powerful, they were also much smaller than atomic bombs, opening up new possible delivery methods and strategies. Both Khrushchev and Eisenhower were under similar pressures. Both wanted to reduce military spending, and nuclear weapons appeared to give them a way to do this. Compared to maintaining huge conventional forces, Strategic nuclear weapons could achieve the same military power more cheaply. Eisenhower also felt the need to offset the Soviet Union's huge conventional advantage. We knew that the Soviets maintained something in the neighborhood of 175 divisions active in Europe at all times. The United States had 20 divisions, only 5 of which were in Europe. Therefore, in the view of the disparity in the strengths of the opposing ground forces, it seemed clear that only by the imposition of our nuclear weapons could we promptly stop a major communist aggression in that area. But Eisenhower also inherited some of Truman's opinions on nuclear weapons. To him, victory and defeat in nuclear war were essentially the same, as he told a group of advisors. The only greater possible tragedy than winning a nuclear war would be losing it. In October 1953, Eisenhower developed a new look policy. He publicly stated that he was ready to use nuclear weapons just as any other munitions. But his true intention was deterrence. The United States would use its nuclear weapons as part of a doctrine of massive retaliation, not as a first. If the Soviets attacked the U.S. or its allies, an American nuclear response would make any Soviet gains useless. The U.S. also developed more diverse delivery systems, like submarines and hardened silos. These ensured that even if the Soviets struck first, the Americans could respond with assured destruction. Eisenhower gambled in the belief that Soviet leaders, despite their ideological differences, were still rational men and did not want to provoke Armageddon. While the U.S. relied on a potential nuclear response to prevent war, the Soviet Union took a different approach. Some experts suggest the English meaning of deterrence does not have an exact Russian language equivalent, and that Soviet nuclear strategy was also rooted in the Red Army's offensive tradition. So the Soviets developed plans not only to fight a nuclear war, but to win one. For the USSR, like any other state, war was a social contest as well as a military one. That meant Soviet military science was subordinate to political doctrine and had to operate under the same Marxist-Leninist principle. These state, among other things, that war can be a vehicle for great social change. And any contest between capitalist and socialist nations will always result in a socialist victory. With these principles in mind, an unwinnable war as envisioned by Eisenhower simply cannot exist. However, Soviet political doctrine also stated that only imperialist, capitalist states can start wars. But at the same time, it was clear that the side who attacked first in a nuclear war would have a huge advantage. To escape this dilemma, the Soviets concentrated on preemptive strike. Only when they were sure a U.S. attack was imminent would they launch their nuclear weapons. The objective was to eliminate enemy military forces, including nuclear weapons, disorganize their rear areas, and suppress the will to resist. As destroying 100% of the enemy's strategic nuclear weapons was unlikely, Soviet authorities relied on strong civil defense measures to minimize damage from an American retaliatory strike. This approach required permanent strategic nuclear forces that were always on high alert. In 1961, Minister of Defense Marshal Rojan Malinovsky made this clear. A realistic assessment of the picture would lead one to believe that what the imperialists are preparing is a surprise nuclear attack on the USSR and the socialist countries. Hence, Soviet military doctrine regards it as the most important, the preeminent, the first priority task of the armed forces to be in a constant state of readiness for effectively repulsing a surprise attack by the enemy and thwarting his criminal designs. The Soviet Union's new strategic rocket forces would be responsible for this decisive strike. Initially, strategic bombers like the Tu-20 Bear and M4 Bison were the primary arm, but the U.S. was simply too far away to rely on slow bombers. Happily for the Soviets, throughout the 1950s, they'd made huge advances in rocketry, as illustrated by Sputnik's launch in 1957. That same year, the Soviet Union developed their first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. Competition between the US and USSR, and especially concerns about a potential missile gap, led both sides to build more and more nuclear weapons. By 1960, the US had a clear superiority, with 18,000 bombs to the Soviet Union's 1,600. It's important to note, as some us analysts did, that saying nuclear victory is possible is not the same as saying that it's desirable. Any Soviet nuclear victory would be Pyrrhic and involve devastation beyond comprehension. Soviet doctrine must be seen from the perspective of their experience in the Second World War, where poor preparation resulted in horrendous losses when Germany attacked them. Nuclear weapons expert Tariq Rauf suggested that the Soviet approach acted as a different kind of deterrent. The Soviets do not need a direct language equivalent of deterrence to practice it. The leaders of the Soviet Union realized that nuclear war would be an unprecedented disaster for socialism. Soviets, however, have always believed that the best way to deter war is to prepare to wage it, in case deterrents fail. Regardless of real Soviet intentions, the preemptive strike strategy was extremely dangerous. Miscommunications, misinterpreted intelligence, or technical glitches could all potentially become triggers for a Soviet preemptive strike. So through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, both the US and USSR had developed some kind of nuclear strategy. America's based on overwhelming response, and the Soviets on preemption. However, Cold War tensions and new technologies soon sent planners back to the drawing board. The early 1960s brought a series of crises which severely tested the US and USSR's resolve and strategy. The 1961 Berlin crisis and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis pushed both sides uncomfortably close to implementing their war plans, with likely catastrophic results. Luckily, cooler heads prevailed, but on both sides of the Iron Curtain, there was a realization that the post-WWE strategies were fairly inflexible. Nuclear weapons had not ended the US-Soviet conflict. They'd simply pushed it elsewhere, like Cuba and Vietnam. Politicians and generals needed more options. In coordination with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, President John Kennedy developed flexible response, a series of diverse strategies which included conventional military, political, economic, and nuclear options. The hope was that this would allow Western forces in the NATO alliance to conduct operations without necessarily provoking direct nuclear retaliation by the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Nuclear weapons were still on the table, but they would be initially limited to, quote, demonstrative use or against purely military targets. In 1962, McNamara stated that the U.S. would not target Soviet cities if the Soviets agreed to do the same. But given that most military installations are near cities, such statements were more optimistic than practical. At the same time, the U.S. developed its strategic triad, ICBMs, strategic bombers, and submarines, to make it clear to the Soviets that a preemptive strike would be useless. Some kind of a nuclear capability would survive a strike. Attitudes were also shifting in the USSR. First Secretary Leonid Brezhnev also began to downplay the possibility of winning a war and shifted more attention to conventional forces, an approach he called "speak softly while you are carrying a big stick." In 1968, the publication Communist of the Armed Forces stated the Soviet view. The point is that the new possibilities of waging armed struggle, meaning for using conventional forces, have arisen not in spite of, but because of the nuclear missile weapons. Technology once again played a role in changes in the 1970s. By the early 70s, ICBMs equipped with multiple individually targetable thermonuclear warheads greatly increased even a single ICBM's destructive potential. The USSR had also caught up with the US, and by 1975 had 20,000 nuclear warheads to the US's 27,000. Soviet leaders now considered it unlikely that the US would launch an unprovoked attack against the USSR, rendering their preemptive strike strategies obsolete. Instead, with financial pressures also playing a role, the 1970s brought discussions on arms limitation. In 1972, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed, allowing both sides to complete launchers and warheads currently under construction, but not to build new ones. By 1976, Brezhnev himself was optimistic. Although world peace is still by no means guaranteed, we have every reason to say with confidence that the improvement in the international climate is convincing evidence that the achievement of lasting peace is not merely a good intention, but a realistic aim. The 1972 Arms Treaty brought hope, but the reality was not the same for everyone. Limitations treaties largely applied to intercontinental strategic nuclear weapons aimed at nuclear states, and the non-nuclear states of Europe were still worried. First, treaties were difficult to monitor, and the superpowers still didn't trust each other. The US pulled out of further talks following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the discovery of Soviet troops in Cuba. Similarly, the US, Britain, and France refused to reciprocate a Soviet no-first-use policy, considering it Soviet propaganda. Some scholars suggest the Soviets wanted to use the no-first-use pledge to support conventional operation. After all, it was unlikely that the Soviet Union would need to use nuclear weapons during a conventional attack. Soviet restraint would limit a NATO response to weaker conventional forces. But military figures on both sides still clung to nuclear weapons, and NATO knew conventional forces alone would not be enough to deter Soviet attack. UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once reportedly reminded her allies, "There is a monument to the failure of conventional deterrence in every French village." The reduction in the size of nuclear warheads allowed for tactical nuclear artillery, intermediate-range missiles, and nuclear landmines. NATO planners in Europe would especially rely on these to stop a Soviet attack through the so-called Fulda Gap in West Germany, the expected site of any Warsaw Pact invasion. NATO forces consistently trained in nuclear biological chemical protective gear in expectation of a nuclear battlefield, and both sides developed radiation-resistant equipment like hermetically sealed tanks. These developments showed a nuclear battlefield was not only theorized, but anticipated. The Soviet Union also likely planned to use a nuclear barrage in a European-wide conflict. Several plans were developed throughout the period, but a Soviet invasion simulation of West Germany, dubbed 7 Days to the Rhine, opened with nuclear strikes on Italy, West Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium, while some plans even called for strikes on neutral Austria. Their goal was to disrupt NATO rear areas and ports, while capitals were largely spared to pressure governments to surrender. Conventional Warsaw Pact forces would then occupy the devastated nations and push on to the Rhine. The Soviets planned to spare France, the US, and Britain from nuclear strikes, likely to avoid nuclear retaliation and provide a basis for a negotiated peace. Of course, it's very possible a Soviet strike against any NATO ally would provoke a response from all. However, it's worth noting that the Soviets envisioned this plan as the response to a NATO nuclear first strike in Poland and Czechoslovakia, as the prelude to a NATO invasion of East Germany. There's also a debate about how serious these plans really were, although the Soviets did distribute them to Warsaw Pact members. As the world entered the 1980s, neither side had been able to develop a working strategy. Mutually assured destruction provided no flexibility, but flexible responses provided too many unknown variables and the possibility for uncontrollable escalation. It was now patently clear A general nuclear war was unwinnable. But military planners still needed to attempt to develop strategies capable of bringing victory. U.S. Ambassador to NATO Harlan Cleveland commented, "Nuclear weapons have turned out to be ultimate in an unanticipated sense of the word. No nation's military planners have been able in 38 years to think up a way to use such huge explosions with such pervasive after effects in ways that are clearly advantageous to their side. This may be the most important thing about nuclear weapons in the 1980s. They are militarily unusable." 1983 also brought more attention and two more close calls. In September, the Soviets shot down a Korean air passenger plane, which it veered into restricted airspace. Later that month, a malfunction in the Soviet early warning system showed 5 ICBMs heading for the Soviet Union, even though there were none. The engineer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decided not to follow protocol and did not trigger the alarm, which would have guaranteed a Soviet nuclear response. He soon discovered the warning was a glitch and likely prevented a nuclear exchange and the deaths of millions. Then in November, NATO carried out an exercise named Able Archer, which simulated a nuclear attack in Western Europe. The Soviets suspected it was really a ruse for war and equipped their nuclear force for imminent retaliation. NATO commanders decided not to respond to the Soviet military activity, and eventually the exercise was concluded without incident. Although no nuclear weapons were launched, such incidents showed that deterrence's stability was not always guaranteed, especially in times of heightened tension. The realization that deterrence wasn't foolproof, combined with large conventional and nuclear forces' growing expense, signaled a further shift. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR underwent economic and social reforms designed to open Soviet society. Coinciding with this was a renewal of arms limitation agreements. Under Gorbachev, the official TASS news agency signaled the changes. A nuclear war is impermissible. There can be no victors. Mutual understanding on this question has been recorded on the summit level. Practical conclusions should be drawn from it. The growing public concern regarding nuclear weapons helped push policymakers further away from considering nuclear war. Films and books portrayed nuclear weapons' apocalyptic potential in a new way, presenting nuclear war as a general catastrophe for all peoples, regardless of their political beliefs. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster further highlighted the dangers of unbridled nuclear forces and likely sped up the Soviet Union's eventual demise. Just before the collapse in 1991, the U.S. and USSR signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the most comprehensive to date. The two countries pledged to reduce stockpiles to 6,000 nuclear warheads each, which meant that by 2001, 80% of nuclear weapons had been decommissioned. The stability of deterrence is still a matter of heated debate. Supporters claim deterrence prevents another great power war, while critics suggest this benefit is by no means guaranteed in the future, especially as new actors, weapons, and crises emerge. There's also an important moral aversion to concepts of mutual destruction spurred by globalization, climate catastrophe, and international tension. This is not entirely new, though. As early as 1962, President Kennedy claimed nuclear weapons gamble today's security against the future's and create a pessimistic geopolitical world. World order will be secured only when the whole world has laid down these weapons, which seem to offer us present security, but threaten the future survival of the human race. The vast resources on this planet are being devoted more and more to the means of destroying instead of enriching human life. But the world was not meant to be a prison in which man awaits his execution. More recently, new powers have obtained or are close to obtaining nuclear weapons, and powers like North Korea and Russia have openly threatened to use them. The so-called nuclear club currently has 9 members, and with possession comes new policies and strategies for their use. For most members, including North Korea and Israel, nuclear weapons provide coercive power and protection from real or perceived existential threats. But nuclear proliferation also increases deterrence-based relationships across the globe and the resulting risks. Whether a future nuclear war can be won remains an open and menacing question. The energy from nuclear fission is not just for military use, though. During the Cold War, both the West and the Soviet Union started utilizing nuclear power for civilian use. Soviet scientists even dreamed of nuclear-powered communism. A new, young, and optimistic generation settled down in so-called atomgrads around the USSR. I'm sure you've heard of one of these atomic cities, at least Pripyat, just north of Kyiv, and next to the Chernobyl reactor. If you're interested to learn more about the Soviet nuclear program, from its origins in World War II to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, you can watch our new documentary series Red Atoms exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that we're building together with other creators, and where we don't have to worry about the algorithm or advertising guidelines, and where viewers directly support creators. If you go to bella.tv/real-time history, you can get 40% off an annual subscription. For just $30 a year, you can watch Red Atoms or our other Nebula original series, and much more. Want to learn more about one of American nuclear triads I mentioned earlier? Then check out Tip of the Spear by Mustard about the iconic B-2 stealth bomber. And of course, on Nebula, you can also watch all our videos ad-free and usually earlier than on YouTube. That's Nebula TV/real-time history for 40% off an annual subscription and supporting us directly. As usual, you can find all the sources for this video in the video description. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for your support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel that would rather advance through the Fulda Gap for a vacation.